the coronavirus? A PR disaster for China or a propaganda victory? And is America's response racist? Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. You know, I criticize the Chinese Communist Party a lot. But as many commenters have pointed out to me, it's also important for me to praise the party when they do things well. So I will. The Chinese Communist Party is really, really good at turning their terrible mistakes into propaganda wins and convincing the rest of the world to agree. They're doing it right now with the coronavirus, and they've done it before too. For example, after Mao Zedong took over in 1949 and enforced collective farming, the Chinese Communist Party plunged the nation into poverty and starvation. Then, Deng Xiaoping made free market reforms, and Chinese people were able to make a living again. But the Chinese Communist Party spun it as if they lifted people out of poverty, even though it was actually Chinese people themselves who worked their way out of poverty once the party backed off a bit with those communist economic policies. Here's how Chinese state-run media covers it. China lifted millions of people out of poverty. The Communist Party has gotten respected global institutions like the World Bank to carry that same line. Then, Chinese state-run media repeat their propaganda, this time citing the World Bank to make it sound legit. Then Western media pick up the story too, because the World Bank said it. So all the credit for lifting people out of poverty goes to China, i.e. the Chinese Communist Party. And nowhere does that article mention how the Chinese Communist Party put all those people in poverty in the first place. It's like you throw someone overboard, watch them struggle to swim, and then eventually you throw them a rope and watch them claw their way back to the boat. And now you're the hero for saving them. The Chinese Communist Party has repeated the same playbook over and over, like with faking GDP growth and covering up their shady organ transplant business, or how they're putting Uyghurs in concentration camps. And now we're seeing that same propaganda machine at work with the deadly coronavirus disease. It's only been a few months, and the virus is spreading globally. And we're seeing headlines like this in Western media. The first signs are emerging that China's coronavirus containment could be working. And can China's COVID-19 strategy work elsewhere? Yes, says the Wall Street Journal. Drastic measures similar to those deployed by China and imposed in parts of Italy to contain the epidemic are now overdue elsewhere. So let's back up and look at how the Communist Party went from massively screwing up the initial response to the outbreak to convincing the world that they did everything right all along. Starting with Step 1, a massive cover-up. As of now, the first case of the coronavirus disease, COVID-19, can be traced back to November 17, 2019. By the final day of 2019, the number of confirmed cases had risen to 266. But the Chinese Communist Party responded not by implementing health measures, but by covering up what was happening. They detained people who talked about it online. They arrested the first doctors who reported on it. As an important political meeting took place in Wuhan, officials spent 2 weeks saying there were no new cases of infection, no firm evidence of human transmission, and no infection of medical workers. Those were all lies. In fact, the coronavirus was already spreading outside China. By mid-January, there were so many cases that the Chinese Communist Party realized they couldn't continue to cover it up. It was time for Step 2, a declaration of war. What cover-up? We're fighting a war against the coronavirus. Communist Party leader Xi Jinping came out and said China will resolutely curb the outbreak of the virus. That's right about when the number of reported cases of coronavirus tripled. The coronavirus wasn't actually spreading faster, it just got politically riskier for local officials to cover it up. especially after central authorities announced that lower-ranking officials who covered up the spread of the virus would be nailed on the pillar of shame for eternity. Then the Communist Party pivoted to Step 3, ruthless authoritarianism. By the end of January, China was reporting almost 12,000 cases of infection and 259 deaths, and those were just the official statistics, so the real numbers were probably much higher. Authorities put an entire province of 58 million people under lockdown and restricted the movements of more than half the country in one way or another. On the ground, local authorities rounded up infected people and put them into mass quarantine centers, even though the conditions were not the most sanitary. When people were caught outside without face masks, police savagely beat them again and again. Or in some cases, authorities even welded sick people into their apartments. And they made sure to censor negative news about the coronavirus outbreak, including disappearing citizen journalists into indefinite quarantines. Did it work? Well, I'll tell you what didn't work. The people of China. They were told not to go back to work, and China's manufacturing hit a record low. But soon, the Chinese Communist Party saw this as a huge problem because their political legitimacy is based on delivering continuous economic growth. Clearly, it was time for Step 4, announcing they've won. The Communist Party has no choice politically but to get people to go back to work and revive the economy. So that's what they've told people to do now. First, state-run media started pushing the narrative that the number of coronavirus infections was on the decline. They started doing this back in mid-February, even though at the time they were A, talking only about areas outside the main epicenter of Hubei province, and B, being misleading. The total number of infections was not actually declining. There were still new infections every day, but the number of new infections per day was declining. They're saying it had gone from this to this, so it's still going up. But forget about that. The Chinese Communist Party leaders wanted you to believe the coronavirus was on the decline in China, and that they controlled it in only 3 weeks. But here's the rub. Communist Party leaders didn't actually believe it themselves. If they did, they wouldn't have canceled their own hugely important political meeting in March. So yes, Chinese leaders were putting a good face on things. And that's why, while they were implementing ruthless authoritarianism and announcing they'd won, they were also Step 5, co-opting respected global institutions. Institutions like the World Health Organization, or WHO. This report on the coronavirus comes from a joint mission between the WHO and the Chinese government. It says China has rolled out perhaps the most ambitious, agile, and aggressive disease containment effort in history. In fact, the leader of the joint mission said hundreds of thousands of people in China did not get COVID-19 because of this aggressive response. Don't worry, he's basing that on data given to the WHO by Chinese scientists. And here's what the head of the World Health Organization had to say.
Almost all member states were praising China for what it did. China took action massively at the epicenter, at the source of the outbreak.
Here's another WHO official.
If I had COVID-19, I want to be treated in China.
If you're wondering how on earth the WHO would be willing to lavish such praise on the Chinese Communist Party, even though this is happening on the ground, I suggest you go back and watch my episode from February 22nd called Coronavirus, How WHO Corruption Helped It Spread. Suffice it to say, when respected global institutions take Chinese money, sometimes it colors their vision and impairs their hearing. And after co-opting the WHO, the Chinese Communist Party has been Step 6, repeating the praise in state-run media. Oh look, the WHO head praises China's efforts to curb the coronavirus. Even the head of the United Nations has praised China's efforts. Here's a video released by state-run CGTN showing how the Communist Party has done such a good job fighting the coronavirus that now they're sending a team of Chinese experts to help in Italy.
China has sent a special medical team to Italy to assist with control efforts there. It comes after China's foreign minister told his Italian counterpart that Beijing stood ready to help.
And after pushing that message through English-language state-run media, the stage is set for Step 7, getting Western media to praise China. Now that the Chinese Communist Party has claimed it's won against the coronavirus and co-opted global institutions to agree and pushed that message aggressively in its own state-run media, it seems Western media are willing to pick up the narrative. Here's a video from South China Morning Post. A 7-member team was sent to Italy, the worst hit country after China. That footage looks familiar. Here's an article from the Associated Press. WHO chief praises China's virus fight, urges more from world. That article does not mention the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up or its ruthless authoritarianism. And here's a reporter from the New York Times interviewed on MSNBC.
China has had enormous success in beating down its epidemic.
He goes on for a full 5 minutes about how great China's approach is. He makes the Chinese medical system look really competent, when that's just not the reality most people on the ground have been facing. Although in a way, he's right.
China has had enormous success in beating down its epidemic.
Clearly, a lot of Western media organizations are not as skeptical as they should be when it comes to the Chinese government's propaganda. Which means now we're going to see Step 8. China saves us all. The natural extension of this is that since the Chinese Communist Party has done such a great job beating the coronavirus, oh, sorry, wrong clip.
If I had COVID-19, I want to be treated in China.
Thank you. Now it's time to learn from China. If only we could implement the same great system here in the West. Western media, take it away. Can China's COVID-19 strategy work elsewhere? Drastic measures similar to those deployed by China to contain the epidemic are now overdue elsewhere. Yes, but could you put it even more clearly? China saves its people as democracies slaughter theirs. And it's not just the idea that China's repressive, authoritarian, communist system has done a great job at containing the coronavirus inside China. It's also the idea that China's repressive, authoritarian, communist system has saved the rest of the world. Back in February, Chinese state-run media started rolling out the idea that China was buying the world time by controlling the epidemic. In fact, they made claims about how the fact that China had 99% of the world's coronavirus cases proved that they were helping the world. You have the most coronavirus, which means you're the best. Got it. Of course, as the coronavirus continued to spread around the world, the Communist Party couldn't claim that they had successfully contained it in China anymore. But the idea that their massive lockdown bought the rest of the world time, well, that took hold, like in this New York Times headline. And that's how the Communist Party has taken what should have been a devastating PR disaster and turned it into a propaganda win. I really got to tip my hat to them. They're truly the best. And now that we're busy trying to drag ourselves out of the water, we've totally forgotten who threw us overboard in the first place. But there are still some pesky Western media that haven't forgotten. And they're blaming China. Which is why the Communist Party's propaganda machine has created a new spin by tapping into a hot-button issue Western media organizations love to report on: racism. So stay tuned after the break for how they've used that to turn us against each other. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. In our last segment, I showed you how the Chinese Communist Party covered up the coronavirus and used ruthless authoritarian tactics to suppress its citizens. And yet, still managed to turn it into a propaganda win. Watch that segment if you haven't already. It's a great lesson on how to create a huge mess and then make everyone believe you are saving them from the mess that you created. But some people here in the West continue to criticize how the Chinese Communist Party has handled the coronavirus, like how they covered it up for weeks, which is why it's now a global pandemic. That makes it much harder for the Chinese Communist Party to claim they've saved the world, which is why the party has a new term for the people who criticize them: racists! Just look at this article in my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times. Racism shows ugly side as China fights coronavirus. I feel like the Communist Party really gets us. As soon as they made it about racism, American media latched onto it. And sure, I get it. There have been documented instances of racism, from the predictable to the weird. Like this questionable Corona time photo from Belgium. And this Mexican performance with a dancing coronavirus wearing a conical hat and a Fu Manchu. And then, from New York City.
This video showing a man on the subway spray an Asian man with Febreze.
Which is not only racist, but also bad science. Febreze cannot neutralize the virus. Also, what kind of person carries around Febreze? There have also been more serious cases of allegedly racist attacks. Anyway, all of this is to say there have definitely been cases of individuals being racist towards Chinese people. Or I guess Asians in general, since racist people don't always try to make that distinction. But that's not what the Chinese Communist Party is concerned about. What they're doing is accusing governments and media organizations of being racist, and using that to push their own propaganda. For example, in February, as the Chinese economy was crashing from the impact of the Communist Party's massive quarantines, the Wall Street Journal published this editorial, calling China the real sick man of Asia. Sick man of blank actually refers to a country that's in trouble economically, and that's very clear if you actually read the article. But as I talked about in a previous episode, sick man of Asia is a term that's historically been considered racist in China, dating back to the early 20th century. So it's not surprising that Chinese state-run media demanded an apology for the racist headline. In fact, they published dozens of articles that criticized the racist and anti-China reaction to the coronavirus that used the Wall Street Journal article as the main example. And Chinese authorities expelled 3 Wall Street Journal reporters from China after it came out, though the expulsion was probably not really about the headline as much as it was getting rid of Western journalists in China. Chinese state-run media also cried racism when a newspaper in Denmark published this image. The article criticized the Chinese regime's cover-up of the coronavirus. The Chinese embassy demanded an apology, which they did not get, because the image wasn't racist against Chinese people, it was satirizing the Chinese government, which allowed the virus to spread because it covered it up for almost 2 months. Foreign governments are not immune to charges of racism either. That Chinese state media article says the Australian government's travel ban on people who had recently been in China provoked a new resurgence of racism, even though the ban was only on people coming to Australia from mainland China. It did not target ethnically Chinese people from coming to Australia from elsewhere, including Taiwan. So the travel ban targeted the country that had the outbreak, not Chinese people. So really, when it comes to media and governments, what we've been seeing is not racism, but words and actions specifically targeted at the country of China and its ruling regime, the Chinese Communist Party. But that nuance is intentionally ignored by the Chinese Communist Party and its state-run media. they want to conflate those issues to play the racism card. Let me show you exactly how they do it. Here's an opinion piece in the LA Times, written by the head of the Chinese consulate in Los Angeles. He spends the first half of the article praising China's response to the coronavirus, claiming that its response saved the rest of the world, and repeating how the World Health Organization is also praising China. This is exactly the type of propaganda spin we talked about in our previous segment. But here's the key paragraph. The Chinese diplomat brings up disturbing reports from around the world about discrimination and stigmatization of the Chinese community. What kind of discrimination? Xenophobia on social media, attacks on Chinese people, and discrimination against Chinese doctors. Then, in the very next sentence, he says, and despite its unparalleled response to the crisis, the Chinese government has been attacked by some people out of ideological prejudice. In 3 sentences, this Chinese diplomat equates criticism of the Chinese government with xenophobia and physical attacks against Chinese people. He's saying they're the same thing. That's the trick. They're taking individual cases of racism and mixing them with targeted actions against the Chinese government and targeted criticisms of the Chinese regime. And state-run media are spinning it as the West is racist against China. Yes, that's the trick. And people are falling for it. In fact, Chinese state-run media have even gone so far as to say racism is a worse enemy than the epidemic. Oh, right, it's racism that's killed 6,000 people in the past 2 months. In February, Chinese state-run media had criticized the U.S. for implementing a travel ban on people who had recently been inside China. And then in March, Chinese state-run media upped their game, claiming it's racist to even say the coronavirus originated in China. This Global Times article says some American officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, are using Wuhan virus, which is considered a racist term. So, even though the first cases of the coronavirus were in Wuhan, China, it's racist to say that? Yes, apparently it is. Because starting in late February, Chinese state media began spinning a new narrative. The idea that the coronavirus may not originate in China. Yes, the origin still hangs in the air. And soon, Chinese social media sites began pushing the idea that the virus really originated in the United States. And then, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson tweeted that it might be the U.S. Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan. Now, at first glance, this seems crazy. But the more they push that idea, the more people will actually start to question whether it really did start in China, especially when you can't say it did without being called racist. The good news is the U.S. government is not letting them get away with it. Last week, the State Department summoned the Chinese ambassador over the Foreign Ministry spokesperson's tweets. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo condemned China's efforts to shift the coronavirus blame on the U.S. in a phone call with a Communist Party official. But that hasn't stopped the Chinese government from pushing the idea that no one really knows where the coronavirus came from. And now, when someone suggests the coronavirus originated in China, they cry racism. What's incredible is how quickly the narrative shifted, because just 8 weeks ago, Chinese state media had specifically referred to the coronavirus as the Wuhan virus. But what's even more incredible is how some Western media companies have completely bought into the Chinese Communist Party's narratives about racism. For example, after a U.S. congressman referred to the Wuhan virus in a tweet, the media jumped on it, saying the remark stirred a racism debate. GOP lawmakers continue to use Wuhan virus or Chinese coronavirus, and Republicans face backlash over racist labeling. Nicely done, Chinese Communist Party. You know us so well. It's only been a few months since the outbreak, and instead of the West criticizing you for your massive cover-up that turned it into a global pandemic that's killed thousands of people, you've got us fighting ourselves over racism. So, dear viewers, I have a suggestion. Let's not call it the Wuhan coronavirus or the Chinese coronavirus. It was the Chinese Communist Party that turned a small number of infections into a global pandemic by covering it up. And that's exactly what they're trying to distract us from. So, let's call it what it really is. The CCP coronavirus. It's hard to argue that's racist. Thanks for watching this episode of China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Stay safe out there.